By the time I understood the corridor had changed, the air already felt wrong in my lungs. It tasted stale like wet dust and old antiseptic, and every breath came with that chalky mineral bite you get in unfinished basements where the concrete never really dries. My flashlight trembled across cinder block walls that should have been 15 paces apart from the nurse's station to the sealed day room door. I'd walked it enough times that night to know the distance in my knees. But the beam kept going. The floor under my boots carried that same low vibration I'd been feeling since sunset, a steady mechanical hum with no source, like a generator buried deep under the slab. The structural creak above me rose and fell around it, not random settling, pressure, slow, loaded, deliberate pressure. I stopped and counted again under my breath, and the corridor answered by stretching. Not all at once, not like a movie trick. It just refused to end where it should have ended. Each time my light found the far wall, there seemed to be another few feet beyond it, and the walls gave a faint inward pulse, as if the whole passage had taken a breath while I watched. Then I saw someone at the end of it. He stood with his shoulder toward me, head bent, writing on the wall with my carpenter's pencil. Same jacket, same flashlight clipped to the chest. Same posture I got after too many hours filling out inspection forms on a clipboard. Me. The smell of damp concrete thickened. I heard the pencil scratching from impossibly far away. The other me finished writing, went still, then turned his head just enough for the light to catch one side of his face. "You already missed it," he said, and I don't remember deciding to step forward. I only remember thinking one thing, hard enough to drown out everything else. What had I already missed? I need to go back to the beginning. The first thing I noticed about Bitterroot Psychiatric Annex was the sound, not the look of it, not the isolation, not even the fencing around the old recreation yard. It was the creaking. Deep, patient, regular. The kind of structural complaint a building makes during hard wind or a fast freeze, except there wasn't any wind that evening, and the temperature sat just above cold enough for sleet. The beams complained anyway, as if the place carried weather inside itself. The second thing I noticed was the smell. Damp concrete, old cleanser, and that dry metallic tang that sits in institutions long after the people are gone. And I parked under a failing sodium lamp and killed the engine. And for a second, the silence from my truck cab felt so complete that it almost convinced me I'd imagined the vibration in the steering wheel. Then I stepped out and felt it again through the soles of my boots. A fine tremor under the pavement that never quite resolved into a pattern. Bitterroot sat 17 miles south of Derby, out in a fold of Ravalli County where the road narrowed and the tree line pressed close enough to make dusk come early. It had been decommissioned for a little over a year. Liability issues, deferred maintenance, an insurance dispute, that was how Lorraine Worth later described it. She didn't say closed, she said decommissioned, like the place had been a machine taken out of service, not a psychiatric annex with patient wards, hydro rooms, med storage. The offices and a fenced courtyard now gone to dead grass and rust. I'd worked contract inspection and overnight maintenance oversight all over western Montana and northern Idaho. Remote rehab wings, old county care homes, facilities no one wanted to pay to demolish and no one wanted to fully abandon. My job wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it. I knew how to read hairline fractures, moisture damage, old foundation movement. I knew which sounds mattered and which ones belonged to age and weather and bad original construction. At least I thought I did. Lorraine Worth met me inside the front vestibule where the heat had long since been shut off and the air held that refrigerator cold of unused buildings. She was in her late 60s, silver hair pinned back too tightly, and she carried a folder under one arm like she'd rather hand me paperwork than a greeting. Her perfume cut through the stale antiseptic, sharp and floral and out of place. "Mr. Ivers," she said. Thanks for taking the overnight. Coulter's fine. She didn't smile at that. It's mostly observation. Exterior checks, interior walkthroughs, incident notation if required. We've had trespass concerns and some questions from the county about shifting conditions. Nothing interventionist unless there's an immediate hazard. That wording lodged with me. Not repair, not correction, documentation. She led me through the main corridor while her shoes clicked a little too fast on the tile. Most of the overhead lights were off. The ones left on buzzed with a weak yellow fatigue, leaving long sections between them in shadow. I could hear the building settling around us, those long, low timber complaints from somewhere above the drop ceiling. Though the place was mostly reinforced concrete and steel, it didn't sound like one system. It sounded like several misaligned ones sharing the same strain. Lorraine kept briefing me without breaking stride. Liability exposure, preservation of current condition, county review. If anything significant changed, I was to record time, location, and apparent nature. She repeated that word changed. Not damaged, not worsened, changed. Has an engineer been in recently? I asked. Several. They disagreed. On what? On what was there? She said it flatly, like she'd grown tired of hearing herself explain it. We stopped at the old nurse's station. A stack of clipboards, fresh incident sheets, facility maps, and a ring of labeled keys waited beside a dead monitor. Lorraine touched the papers with 2 fingers. You'll do a perimeter check every hour. Interior pass between. If you note anything structural, mark location clearly in the log. Mark it physically, if needed. There was a small box of chalk on the desk beside her hand. I remember that because it struck me as old-fashioned. I remember thinking there were better ways to tag movement. This isn't an active treatment facility anymore, she said. No patients, no staff overnight. You'll be alone. That should have reassured me. It mostly did. Looking back, that was the last uncomplicated assumption I made all night. I asked what happened to the last overnight orderly. Lorraine hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Silas Holbrook left the position. Quit. Effectively. Because of the building? Her eyes went to the corridor over my shoulder, then back to me. Because he decided he was no longer suited to isolated work. There was something prepared about the answer. I let it pass. At the time, that felt professional. People burn out. Old facilities get inside your nerves. Rural night assignments do stranger things to attention than most office people understand. Lorraine walked me to the staff room, showed me the breaker access I wasn't to touch, the locked med closet I wasn't to open, and the supply locker where replacement flashlights, gloves, tape, and cleaning materials were stored. When she handed me the master ring, her fingers were cold enough to make me notice. If anything seems off, she said, you'd write it down before you decide what it means. I almost asked why she said it like that. Almost. Instead, I gave the practiced answer. Understood. She left a few minutes later. I listened to her car crunch away over gravel outside, listened until the taillights were gone from the front windows. Then there was only the low vibration in the floor and the slow, patient creaking overhead. I made my first pass with the confidence of a man who thought he'd seen every version of deferred maintenance. The annex had 3 main wards branching from a central administrative spine. Day rooms sealed, bedrooms stripped. Observation panels painted over from the outside. The farther back I walked, the colder the air got, and not evenly. Some doorways breathed a damp chill across my hands when I passed them. Others held a trapped warmth, stale and faintly organic, as if they hadn't finished emptying out. The facility map Lorraine left me was old but usable. Minor discrepancies didn't concern me. A storage closet relabeled, a treatment room converted to records overflow. I noted water staining in a rear stairwell, spalling near an exterior loading door, one section of floor tile lifting at the edge where moisture had gotten in. Routine. Annoying, but routine. On my second circuit through the staff corridor, I found the locker. It was half-open, metal door bent slightly at the hinge, and a strip of masking tape across the front had been written over so many times the original label had become a gray blur. On the newest layer, in careful black block letters, someone had written SRH Silas Reed Holbrook, and the smell inside the locker came out first when I pulled it fully open. Paper, cold metal, old sweat ground into fabric. There was a jacket hanging inside, facility issued, one elbow darkened with what looked like repeated contact against concrete. A thermos with the lid missing, a dead flashlight, and on the bottom shelf, stacked with a precision that didn't fit the rest, were 3 yellow legal pads and a folded packet of loose pages clipped together. I should have called Lorraine right then. A former employee's things still left behind in a decommissioned psychiatric annex was reason enough. Instead, I crouched down and started reading, because that was the kind of man I was. I liked records. I trusted written things more than spoken ones. The handwriting was tight and deliberate, not frantic, not spiraling, repetitive in a way that suggested someone trying to make a point stick, either for himself or for whoever came next. The first page wasn't a diary entry. It was a list. If a hallway appears longer than before, do not walk its full length. Mark any structural change immediately. Do not assume it will remain consistent. If you hear movement in the walls, leave the area without investigating. Never correct the same issue twice. If you see yourself performing a task, stop observing immediately. The building remembers what you ignore. I remember letting out a breath through my nose when I got to the last line. Not because it scared me, because it irritated me. It sounded like the kind of apocalyptic nonsense people write when too much isolation and too little sleep start sanding down the edges of reason. Silas had either been unwell, or he had wanted to unsettle the person who came after him. I turned the page. More notes, repeat phrases, times without dates. Room numbers circled and crossed out. The phrase "mark it" now written over and over in the margin until the pen had nearly torn through the paper. There was no context, no explanation, just observations written like field notes from someone who believed he needed to outrun his own forgetfulness. Hall West was 12 paces at 8 in the evening, 15 at 9 in the evening, 13 again at 9:15. Do not wait to confirm. Do not let it settle unmarked. I sat back on my heels and listened. The annex gave me the same answer it had been giving me since I arrived. A long, low beam creak from somewhere above, then silence, then the faint floor vibration under my boots. Nothing in the walls, nothing moving, and I checked the time on my watch, not even an hour into the shift. The professional explanation came easily. Silas had worked alone in a failing building. He'd gotten jumpy, started patterning random defects into a system, and then he'd quit. Lorraine, not wanting to explain a former employee's breakdown to a contractor, had simply left the locker untouched. That fit the facts I had. It fit them cleanly. Clean fits had always been hard for me to resist. I folded the rules and slipped them into my jacket pocket. I told myself I was preserving potential evidence. I told myself I'd mention it in the morning after I had a full night's notes to compare against the rambling. Then I shut the locker and kept walking. I did not follow a single rule on that page. The next hour passed quietly enough to keep me smug. I made a perimeter loop. I checked locked exits, listened at the generator room door even though the facility's primary systems had supposedly been shut down months before. The vibration in the floor persisted, subtle as a truck idling half a mile away. It never strengthened. It never faded. I stopped noticing it until I stood still, and then it came back up through my legs. When I re-entered the main spine corridor, the smell of damp concrete sharpened hard enough that I paused. Not stronger exactly. Closer, as if some sealed pocket of wet had opened somewhere nearby. That was when I heard the tapping. Faint, irregular, not a pipe knock, not the hollow skitter of mice. It came from inside the left wall near the old consult rooms, 2 quick taps, then a pause, then 3 more, each one soft enough that I had to hold my breath to catch it. I took 2 steps closer, and the beam from my flashlight ran along painted block, over a bulletin board still pinned with blank forms, over a hairline seam in the plaster patch above the baseboard. The tapping stopped. I waited. Nothing. I put my ear closer to the wall. The concrete breathed back cold. No tapping, no movement. Just the distant structural complaint of the building and that low-floor hum. If you hear movement in the walls, leave the area without investigating. I actually thought of the line then. I almost laughed. Instead, I paced the corridor. I knew the distance from the nurse's station to the sealed day room at the far end because I'd already walked it twice. 15 paces in my stride, maybe 16 if I cut it short around the dented cart somebody had left half inside an alcove. I counted automatically. Yet one thing about inspections is you learn your own body as a measuring device. 15. I reached the door, turned and paced back. 15 again. I made a note on my clipboard about moisture smell near consult wing, then crossed it out because smell alone wasn't a reportable condition. That was the first omission of the night, and it was small enough to feel harmless. On my next interior pass, maybe 40 minutes later, I entered the same corridor and got halfway down before the proportions felt wrong. The air seemed deeper. The overhead fixtures looked farther apart. The beam from my flashlight hit the far door and somehow didn't satisfy the eye. There was too much hall between me and it, like I'd stepped into a slightly enlarged replica of the same space. I stopped and counted. 17. I frowned. I backed up to my starting point by the nurse's station and counted again with deliberate even strides. 17. It irritated me more than it frightened me. I walked it a third time. 17. The day room door at the end looked unchanged. The walls looked unchanged. Same flaking paint, same water stain feathering down from the ceiling seam. But my body said the distance had gained 2 paces. I stood there long enough to hear the tapping start again inside the wall to my right, very light, almost polite. Then it stopped when I turned my head. I should have written it down. That was what Lorraine had said. Write it down before you decide what it means. I had a line open on the clipboard. Time, corridor, apparent dimensional discrepancy, further verification needed. And instead I told myself what any tired contractor tells himself when a measure doesn't line up with memory. I'd miscounted the first time, or altered stride length without realizing it, or taken the line from the wrong tile seam. Buildings didn't lengthen because you looked away. Corridors didn't breathe. Men alone at night got suggestible, and suggestibility could ruin a clean report faster than negligence. I wrote nothing. The creaking above me changed. It didn't get louder all at once. It deepened. The pitch dropped, and for the first time that night it seemed to travel through the structure in sequence, not random spots settling independently, but a load transferring from one section to another as if the annex had shifted weight. I felt it in the hand holding my flashlight. A slow pressure change, one beam accepting stress from the next. And that should have been the moment I left the corridor. Instead, I finished the round, told myself I'd recheck later, and kept my incident log neat. By midnight, the facility had begun to feel less empty than unattended. That's the best way I can put it. Not occupied, not haunted in any childish sense, just full of processes that continued whether I was there to witness them or not. Doors held temperatures that didn't match the rooms behind them. The air moved in little directional breaths through cracks and thresholds, carrying smells from places that should have been sealed. and every now and then, if I stopped walking and let the quiet settle around me, I could hear some internal strain traveling through the bones of the building like someone shifting position under a blanket. I found the crack in the west ward wall a little after 1 in the morning. I smelled wet plaster before I saw it. Freshly opened, that sharp, dusty, damp scent as if somebody had just drilled through a cold foundation. The crack ran from waist height near a linen closet door up toward the ceiling at a shallow angle. No more than 6 feet long, thin in some places, wider in others. I was certain it hadn't been there on the previous pass. Certain enough that I crouched to feel the edges with 2 fingers. The plaster lip was cool and dry. No crumble on my glove, no exposed rust line. It looked new and old at the same time, if that makes any sense, as if I'd caught it halfway between formation and memory. I stood there with the chalk box in my hand and Silas's folded rules pressing against my chest pocket. He mark any structural change immediately. That one at least sounded like common sense. So I marked it, a quick white line at the bottom terminus with a time beside it, then another at shoulder height. Standard practice. If movement worsened, I'd have reference points. The chalk squealed faintly against the painted surface. The sound seemed to carry too far down the corridor. I made the note on my clipboard this time. Hairline fracture, west ward, south wall, apparent new development. Physical tag applied. Monitor progression. Then I kept moving. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes before I came back. I know because I checked the time twice, once after a rear exit lock check, once before turning into the ward again. I expected the crack to be there where I'd left it. It wasn't, and the wall stood smooth and blank in the flashlight beam, painted institutional cream over concrete board. No split, no fracture, no feathered line up toward the ceiling. The chalk marks remained. They hung in empty air a little above the surface. Not by much, less than the width of my thumb, but enough that the lower mark cast a tiny shadow behind it when I moved the light. I don't know how long I stared before I stepped closer. The air near the wall felt colder. My own breath sounded too loud. I reached out and put one fingertip against the lower chalk line. It met resistance before my knuckle touched paint. There was a surface there. Invisible, or nearly so, a thin plane where the crack should have been. Smooth and hard and flat, my finger traced along it and found nothing but wall behind it. Yet the chalk clung to that absent seam as if the building had taken my correction and filed the flaw somewhere just out of sight. My mouth had gone dry. I remember swallowing and hearing it. "All right," I said out loud because hearing my own voice mattered then. It sounded wrong in the corridor. Too close, then too far. Never correct the same issue twice. That line came back to me with a force I didn't like. I took my pencil and hovered it over the clipboard. If I wrote exactly what I'd seen, there would be no clean language for it. Floating chalk mark. Apparent displacement of tag defect from observable surface. Possible visual distortion. Once words like that entered a formal incident log, they stopped being mine. They became record, liability, evidence. Maybe proof of my own compromised state. And so I did what I had trained myself to do whenever facts refused to fit the shape expected of them. I edited. I wrote that the previously observed fracture was not visible on second inspection, but tag location retained for further monitoring due to uncertain surface irregularity. It was vague enough to protect me. Honest enough, I told myself, to preserve the situation without overcommitting to an explanation. Then I put the chalk back in my pocket and walked away. I wish I could tell you that I understood the significance then. I didn't. What I felt was a tightness under the ribs, not quite fear, more like professional embarrassment. Things had gotten strange enough that I couldn't maintain the neat separation between defect and observer. And my first instinct was still to smooth the report. That instinct had cost people before. I hadn't let myself think about that in a long time. The break room sat off administrative services behind a pair of half-frosted swing doors. It smelled older than the rest of the annex, stale coffee, damp cardboard, and the sweet rot of something spilled years ago behind an appliance and never fully cleaned. I went there around 2 in the morning because I wanted fluorescent light, a table, and something ordinary to do with my hands. The cassette recorder was in the bottom drawer under a stack of blank intake forms. Not digital, actual tapes. Cheap office dictation cassettes with handwritten labels across the paper inserts. Most were marked with times or room numbers. 2 had SH written on them. 1 simply said West Hall again. I almost left them alone. Then the building gave a long descending groan overhead, in the kind that starts in one beam and ends in another, and a cup in the sink trembled against enamel with the floor vibration. That was enough to make me take the recorder out and feed in the first tape. Silas Hallbrook's voice came through with a hiss under it, dry and controlled and younger than I'd expected. Not panicked, not rambling. He sounded like somebody making notes for a job file after a long shift. First round was normal, he said. Second round, consult hall added distance. I didn't mark because I wanted a confirmation pass. That was a mistake. Mark it now. If it changes, mark it now. He repeated that phrase 3 times before the tape clicked and ran out. I sat still and listened to the motor spin uselessly for a moment before ejecting it. My fingertips had gone cold, not because of what he said, because of how he said it. And he used the same compressed work language I used in my own logs, stripped of dramatics, stripped of self-pity. It sounded competent, which made it harder to dismiss. The second tape was worse. North treatment wall showed propagation line at shoulder height. I delayed notation. On return, visible line absent, material displacement uncertain, tag remained. Don't rewrite the condition because you don't like the condition. I froze with the recorder in my hand. There are phrases you forget until you hear them spoken back to you. Material displacement uncertain. Condition remains within acceptable tolerance pending follow-up. Non-critical variance. Those were the kinds of phrases I had used years earlier on a clearance report for a municipal substructure rehab outside Missoula. The job where I signed off on a support corridor that should have been red-tagged and closed until a full re-inspection. We were behind schedule. The contractor wanted continuity. The deformation looked minor if you wanted it to. I wanted it to. 3 workers got caught in a partial collapse 2 days later. Not killed, injured, broken leg, crushed shoulder, 1 man with nerve damage in his hand that never healed clean. The report trail buried the cause under contributing factors and unforeseen material fatigue. I was never named. I was never even questioned directly. I kept my license. I kept working. And I buried the language I had used to make my convenience sound professional. Hearing it in Silas's voice felt like someone had reached into a locked room in my head and switched on the light. I rewound the tape and played that section again, and same wording, same rhythm. It might not have been exact, but it was close enough to make the skin on my neck tighten. The third tape started with silence, then a low scraping sound, then Silas breathing. I saw myself in West Services, he said. Didn't understand it at first. Thought reflection. Thought fatigue. He was marking conduit separation and writing the measure wrong. Not random wrong, manageable wrong. The kind that keeps a problem from becoming paperwork. I watched too long. He stopped speaking for a few seconds. Behind his voice, faintly, I heard the facility, the same beam creaks, the same low tremor under everything. If you see yourself working, he said finally, very calm, don't stay for the explanation. There isn't one. Mark it now. That was the point when I should have called Lorraine Worth, woken the county, and walked out something. Instead, I sat in a dead break room with that old recorder in my hand and listened to the tape hiss. What kept me there wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was recognition. The building hadn't just become strange, it had become specific. Silas was describing the particular shape of error I knew best, the tidy little professional lie that reduced a hazard into something administratively survivable. I didn't want to admit why that frightened me more than a voice in the wall would have. That was the moment the annex stopped feeling like a site and started feeling like an accusation. I gathered the tapes, the recorder, and Silas's notes and carried them back to the nurse's station. I spread everything out under the desk lamp and started building sequence. Notes against recordings, times against my own route, and I was no longer just working a shift. I was comparing documents, trying to establish whether Silas had experienced the same pattern in the same order, or whether I was shaping his fragments to fit my night. The answer came faster than I wanted. West corridor length discrepancy, then the tag defect, then self-observation during maintenance task. The handwriting on one sheet had become so indented from repetition that I could read the pressure marks from pages above it. Mark it now. Do not clean it up. A hook lodged under my thoughts then, cold and final. I knew now what the building was doing, at least in outline. I just didn't know whether documentation controlled it or fed it. The warm door handle should have sent me running. I was making another westward pass, recorder in one pocket, chalk in the other, and my clipboard tucked under one arm with more care than I'd ever given one before. The corridor air felt cooler there than in admin, and there was a smell in it now like wet stone turned up from deep ground. I reached for a closed treatment room door I'd already checked twice that night and stopped with my hand just short of the lever. Heat. Not room warmth trapped in metal. Recent use. The handle felt faintly warm, as if someone had gripped it not 30 seconds earlier. I was alone. Every sound in the corridor seemed to narrow, the distant creaking overhead, the floor vibration under my heels. My own jacket sleeve brushing the clipboard when I shifted. I put my hand on the lever anyway and opened the door. Inside, under the dead fluorescent panel and the drifting smell of dust, a man stood with his back to me, measuring the far wall. And he had my shoulders, my jacket, my flashlight clipped where I wore mine. His left boot heel was worn at the outside edge exactly the way mine was from an old ankle injury I never bothered correcting. He held the tape wrong. That was the first thing I noticed, not because it was impossible, but because it was familiar. He'd hooked it against a crumbling corner and let it bow slightly midway across the span, enough to steal almost an inch and make the wall seem truer than it was. It was the kind of lazy measure you used when you wanted the answer to stay inside tolerance. "Hey," I said. He didn't turn. The room smelled sharply of powdered plaster. Not fresh, disturbed. There was a distortion in the wall 3 feet to his right, not a crack this time, but a subtle inward swell, like the surface had softened and then firmed again in the wrong shape. He ignored it. He kept his eyes on the tape, pencil moving across a clipboard. "Don't do that," I said, and the words came out lower than I'd meant. He wrote anyway. I took one step forward. The floor gave that low traveling vibration, stronger this time, enough to loosen dust from the ceiling vent. The other me lifted his head just slightly, as if listening to something farther inside the wall than I could hear. Then I looked at the distortion. Only for a second, maybe less. When I looked back, the room was empty. No movement, no retreating footstep, no second door open. Just the treatment room, dead light, stale air, and my own breathing going too fast in the silence. My clipboard slipped in my hand. There was fresh writing on the top sheet. A West treatment room wall, east face, 12 feet 4 inches, surface within acceptable variance. I hadn't written it. I knew my own block print and pressure pattern. This wasn't mine, not exactly. But it used my abbreviations, my shorthand, my lie. I crossed the room in 2 steps and put the flashlight against the wall. The inward swell I'd seen before was gone. The tape measure in my pocket when I snapped it out and checked the span twice gave me 12 feet 4 inches exactly. The wrong number had become the room. I don't know if I made a sound then. I remember my mouth opening. I remember the taste of cold dust on the back of my tongue. Mostly I remember the sudden awareness that every earlier omission had not stayed earlier. They were accumulating, not in me, in the structure. Never correct the same issue twice. And the rule didn't read like paranoia anymore. It read like contamination control. I backed into the corridor and pulled the door shut so hard the latch snapped. The handle in my hand was still warm. For the next hour, the annex stopped pretending to be stable. Doors no longer opened where the map said they should. A linen closet gave onto a short hall ending at a fire exit that belonged on the opposite side of the building. A patient room near the rear ward opened into record storage I'd only seen off administration. The stairwell landing outside Hydro looped me back to the same landing after one flight down, but the smell changed each time. Bleach on the first pass, wet rust on the second, damp soil on the third. I quit trusting geometry and started trusting sequence. This door had been here before. In that dent in the cart rail used to face north. The nurses' station should not have been visible from that angle. The building wasn't just shifting. It was resolving errors, smoothing contradictions into new arrangements that held as long as they went unchallenged. And every time I found one I'd failed to log earlier, it had settled harder. I spread the facility maps across the nurses' station and compared them to my notes, then to Silas's. Some of his room references no longer matched any current layout. Others fit too well. He had circled intersections that didn't exist on paper but did now, if you took the new passage between services and West Ward as given. His annotations weren't describing a delusion. They were describing previous versions. That was when the moral shape of the place finally showed itself. I could document everything, in every impossible connection, every altered span, every vanished defect and retained tag. I could fill the log until dawn, make a clean, truthful record, and in doing so, hand the annex a stable account of itself. If Silas was right, if my own eyes were right, observation wasn't neutral here. A documented change stopped being uncertain. It hardened. It entered the official world. But if I refused to record it, if I left the discrepancies unmarked, the building didn't reset. It spread. Hallways lengthened further. Wrong measures replaced right ones. A flaw not fixed didn't remain a flaw. It propagated. I knew that logic. I had lived it once already. At the municipal rehab job years before, I'd seen a load shift at a support corridor joint, minor on paper, correctable with delay, bracing, expense. And I had written it down in a way that made immediate action unnecessary. Not a direct lie. Worse, a selective truth. Enough record to protect procedure, not enough to stop consequence. Convenience disguised as restraint. Standing in that nurse's station with the annex flexing around me, I felt the full weight of what I'd done back then for the first time in years. Not the public version, not the insurance summary, the choice itself. I had seen instability and decided the cleaner record mattered more than the ugly interruption it required. The building had found the exact shape of my guilt and built itself out of it. Silas's last notes were paper-clipped separately from the rest. The pages smelled faintly sour as if they'd sat in damp a long time before drying again. His handwriting had changed on them, still precise but heavier. He pressed harder into the page. It isn't collapse. That sentence stood alone at the top. It adapts to observation. Marked changes bind. Ignored changes migrate. Do not confuse containment with safety. Do not assume leaving ends your part in it. The phrase hit me harder than anything else because it didn't tell me what to do. It only stripped away the comfort of believing there was a correct procedure waiting if I could think clearly enough. There wasn't. The dilemma had teeth on both sides. I could hear the building answering itself, then long creaks chasing one another through ceiling and wall, the floor vibration stronger under the nurse's station than anywhere else, as if the whole annex centered there now. My log lay open in front of me, blank lines waiting. I pictured filling them honestly. Corridor length discrepancy, surface displacement detached from visible wall plane, topological reconfiguration between sealed units, self-observation event during measurement. If those statements had weight here, if language anchored structure, then I would be helping something impossible become durable. I would be installing the wrongness into the record the way I'd once installed safety into a report that didn't deserve the word. But if I wrote nothing, if I tried to outrun it with silence, then what was I doing except repeating the original sin in a new location? Ignoring instability because confronting it had consequences. There was no clean version. That was the horror of it, not danger. Responsibility? I stood there with the pencil hovering while the annex ticked and groaned around me. I wrote one line, stopped, tore the sheet free, crumpled it. They flattened it again. I took out Silas's note that said "Mark it now" and stared at the pressure marks beneath the letters hard enough to dimple the paper. He had sounded calm on the tapes, helpful. But even that help carried a shadow now. Had Silas marked everything because he believed he was containing it, and in doing so made it more real? Or had he learned too late that refusing to mark simply let it outgrow the walls? Was he warning me away from his mistake or luring me into the same loop? The foil in him wasn't disagreement, it was proximity. He felt less like a predecessor than a version of my own judgment recorded a little farther down the line. I made my choice badly, which was the only way it could be made. I documented some things and not others, the measurable ones I wrote. Corridor extension, door misalignment, environmental vibration. The ones that implicated me more directly, the self I saw writing manageable wrong numbers, the way the wall had accepted the false measurement, the way the chalk floated where the crack no longer existed, I reduced, softened, phrased around. Even then I couldn't stop myself from cleaning the language. The building answered immediately. A deep shudder ran through the slab from west to east. Lights flickered on in 3 rooms that were no longer connected on any map. Somewhere inside the walls, the tapping started up in 6 places at once, quick and urgent and moving. The nurse's station desk lamp dimmed and brightened. On the floor plan beneath my hand, 2 room boundaries had shifted in pencil, though I hadn't touched them. And that was the moment I understood that selective documentation wasn't neutral either. It wasn't compromise, it was instruction. I had taught the annex how to lie in my voice. The final tape was in the recorder before I remembered loading it. I only know I did because I heard Silas inhale and lift his words through static. "If you're hearing this," he said, "you've already started editing. I did too." My scalp went cold. He continued in that same steady tone, and behind him I heard footsteps on tile. Unhurried, one set only. I thought the danger was bad measurements becoming true. That's part of it. The worst part is what happens after. Once the place learns how you'll soften a thing, it stops needing your hand. It can use your omissions. I gripped the recorder harder. "I'm leaving at dawn," Silas said, "or I already did. I can't tell which version of that sentence is right anymore. The road from the front gate doesn't line up with the road that brought me here. If I stay, I keep helping it settle. If I go, I take the unmarked parts with me. Mark it now. Mark it now. Mark it now." The repetition didn't sound frantic, it sounded exhausted. Then very softly, as if he'd turned his head toward an open door, Silas said, "I hear it playing outside." The tape clicked off. A second later, from somewhere beyond the front entrance of the annex, I heard the same line in the same calm voice, thin through distance and concrete. "I hear it playing outside." I didn't move. My whole body had gone still around the sound. The front corridor carried it faintly, as if a recorder sat on the steps beyond the vestibule doors, speaking inward through the crack in the frame, and I could hear the hiss beneath the words. The building creaked once deeply and fell quiet enough that the tape outside seemed louder. There was no way for that sound to be there before I got to the entrance. No speaker system, no one else in the facility, no one on the grounds. Yet Silas was outside, or his voice was, speaking from the next point in the sequence before I had reached it. That was the reveal, though I didn't have a name for it then. Silas had never felt like a stranger in those notes because he wasn't occupying the role of another man. He was the echo ahead of me, the documented trace of someone who had moved through the same moral geometry and left evidence at intervals. Not my literal future, maybe. Not exactly, but near enough to it that his instructions kept arriving from a few minutes farther along than I was able to stand. I took the recorder, the notes, the incomplete incident log, and walked to the front entrance. Every step there felt measured by the floor. The vibration rose and faded under my boots in slow pulses. The antiseptic smell near admin gave way to cold night air leaking through the outer doors. The creaking in the walls no longer sounded random. It sounded like a structure settling under fresh load. I unlocked the vestibule and opened the inner door. No recorder sat outside. The pre-dawn dark had that deep Montana blue to it, almost colorless, with the mountains reduced to heavier black behind the trees. Frost silvered the rail by the steps. My truck waited under the dead lamp where I'd left it. The gravel lot lay empty, but from somewhere to the left near the edge of the fenced yard, Silas's voice was still playing. "I'm leaving at dawn," then farther away by the gate. The road from the front gate doesn't line up. Not one source moving. Several sources at once, as if copies of the same moment had been set down along the grounds at different distances. I stood in the doorway listening to him leave in stages. I didn't go to the fence. I didn't try to chase the sound. Maybe that was survival. Maybe it was cowardice. I only know I got into my truck with the recorder on the passenger seat and the official incident log still unfinished beside it. The engine turned reluctantly in the cold. When the headlights swept the access road, I felt my stomach pull tight. The road bent wrong. Not violently, not enough to make a stranger notice, but I knew the line I'd driven in on. 2 shallow curves between the gate and county blacktop, a washout shoulder to the right, a drainage ditch running parallel until the cottonwoods. Now the second bend started too early and the ditch crossed under the road at an angle I didn't remember. As if a survey crew had rebuilt the whole approach from a flawed set of notes and come close enough to fool anyone without prior knowledge. I sat there with my hands on the wheel while the building creaked behind me and the recorder on the seat hissed into silence. If I turned back, maybe I could finish the report honestly. Maybe I could mark everything, accept whatever permanence that created and contain it there. If I drove away, I was choosing omission again. Maybe not out of malice this time, out of fear, out of self-preservation. But omission doesn't care why you do it. The eastern horizon had started to pale. Dawn was taking the decision away from me minute by minute. In the end, I drove. The tires found the wrong road as if it had always been there. Gravel whispered under the chassis. The ditch held to my left when I knew it should have been right. Twice I passed reflector posts set a little too far apart, and each time I felt the same sick recognition I had in the west corridor when 15 paces became 17. Close enough to reality to be usable. Wrong enough that only someone who remembered the first version would feel the theft. I kept glancing in the mirror. Bitterroot Psychiatric Annex receded by degrees, low and blocky against the thinning dark, until the front lamp disappeared and the whole place blended into tree line and slope. I expected relief then. Instead, I found myself listening for the building through the truck, for the floor vibration that had lived in the slab all night. At the county road, I pulled over and looked at the log on the passenger seat. My handwriting stared up at me, formal and partial. I did not submit it that morning. I told Lorraine Worth I had concerns about structural instability and declined further shifts. I said the layout felt unsafe under solo conditions. I said the annex needed a full assessment before overnight staffing continued. All true, none complete. She listened in a silence that told me she had heard versions of that before. When she asked for the incident log, I said I'd misplaced part of my notes in transit and needed to reconstruct them. I never did. That was the last contact I had with Bitterroot directly. No county investigator came to my door, no lawsuit surfaced, no news story crossed my screen about the annex folding in on itself or swallowing a road in Ravalli County. Life, for a while, resumed its old shape with insulting ease, which should have frightened me more than it did. A week later, I was back in my apartment in Missoula, living inside the ordinary sounds I had once wanted so badly. Upstairs plumbing, traffic sighing through wet streets, the neighbor's television bleeding through one shared wall. I kept Silas's notes in a kitchen drawer beside takeout menus and dead batteries. I kept the recorder unplugged in a cabinet. I told myself I was waiting until I could think clearly enough to organize everything into a coherent account. What I was really doing was what I'd always done, and delaying the moment when observation became obligation. The first sign was the smell. I came home after dark, unlocked the apartment, and caught a faint mineral damp beneath the detergent and radiator dust. Concrete wetness, though my building was old brick over timber. I stood in the entry listening. Pipes ticked. Somebody laughed 2 units over. Then under it, so low I almost dismissed it, a steady vibration through the floorboards. Not strong. Barely there. I took off my coat and found the carpenter's pencil still in the breast pocket where I'd left it after Bitterroot. My fingers had already closed around it before I understood what I was doing. In the bedroom near the corner above the baseboard, there was a crack in the wall that hadn't been there that morning. Thin, angled, about 3 feet long. I knew my own apartment well enough to be certain. The air near it felt a fraction colder. When I crouched, the plaster held that dry, damp smell, the same contradiction I'd noticed in the annex, as if something old and newly exposed occupied the same line. I listened, and for 1 second I thought I heard a tiny tap from somewhere behind it. Then silence. I held the pencil over the crack and did nothing. That was when I understood the real choice had never been at the nurse's station, not entirely. It had followed the same way an unfinished sentence follows you until you either say it or choose not to. I had left Bitterroot without a full record. I had already taught whatever system governed that place how I handled instability. Not with denial, with selective omission, and with the professional softening that made me feel responsible without requiring me to tell the whole truth. Now the same rules applied in a room with my bed in it. I didn't mark the crack. I didn't call the landlord. I didn't photograph it. I didn't write down the time. I stood there with the pencil in my hand and felt the floor under me carry that faint, impossible vibration, steady as distant machinery, and I understood that inaction was also a form of report. Later that night, after I'd put the pencil on the nightstand and turned out the light, I lay awake listening to the building around me settle into sounds I could no longer trust to be ordinary. Just before sleep took me, I heard one soft tap from inside the bedroom wall, and I left it unmarked.